At 3 in the morning, 21-year-old Emily Harris finished her night shift at a Circle K in Phoenix, Arizona. She walked out alone and never made it home. The next day, her roommate noticed her bed was untouched. By the second day, her family reported her missing. On the third day, detectives searching the route she usually walked found one of her shoes on the side of the road. The ground showed marks of a struggle. No phone, no backpack, no body. Investigators focused on two men. The first was a local with a violent past, seen loitering near the store that week. The second was a young man who had pursued Emily relentlessly. A witness recalled seeing him outside the Circle K on the night she vanished. Still, nothing tied either man to the crime. No DNA, no clear witness. The case froze in uncertainty. For 12 years, Emily's family waited. Rumors tore through the community. Some believed the ex-con was guilty. Others pointed to the rejected admirer. But there was no proof. Then in 2019, a serial killer was arrested in New Mexico. Under interrogation, he admitted targeting women who worked late shifts. Emily Harris, he said, was one of his first victims. He described pulling her into his car and leaving her body in the desert. Her remains were never found. But the details matched the evidence. Her missing shoe, the struggle on the roadside, the unanswered questions that haunted a family and a town for more than a decade. If you want more true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and follow along. Emily Harris was 21 years old. She lived in a modest apartment on West Monroe Street in Phoenix, Arizona, not far from the busy Interstate 17. The apartment was small, shared with a roommate, and located in a working-class neighborhood where rent was affordable, but safety was always a question. Her parents, Robert and Linda Harris, lived close by. Robert worked as a mechanic at a local auto shop, spending long hours repairing engines and transmissions for steady pay. Linda stood behind the counter of a neighborhood grocery store, working as a cashier for over 2 decades. Together, they had raised their 2 children on modest wages, never wealthy, but proud that the bills were paid and the family was intact. Emily's younger brother, Daniel, was still in high school at the time. He was 16, busy with homework and sports, while his sister was already pushing herself toward independence. Emily had dreams bigger than the routine she was living. She wanted to study nursing at a community college. It wasn't just an idea, it was her plan. She had already looked into the courses, the fees, and the time it would take. To pay for tuition, she worked nights at a Circle K convenience store located just off the interstate. It was a job that demanded long, quiet hours, but it gave her a paycheck and, more importantly, flexibility for the future she wanted. Friends and co-workers described her as steady, dependable, and responsible. She wasn't the type to cancel a shift, show up late, or leave things undone. Managers relied on her to keep the store running overnight when customers trickled in, most of them buying gas, cigarettes, or coffee on their way through. That kind of trust wasn't given lightly. It was earned, shift after shift. Emily kept a simple routine. She clocked in around 7 p.m., stocked shelves, cleaned the counter, and worked the register. At 3 a.m., her shift ended. From there, she usually walked the short route back to her apartment. It was a stretch she had traveled dozens of times, maybe hundreds. 15 minutes on foot. Past a couple of quiet intersections, across one main road, and then into her building. To most people, it seemed ordinary, even boring. But in the early morning darkness, when businesses were closed and the streets were nearly empty, that walk carried risks. Despite those risks, Emily rarely complained. She was used to the hours. Her paycheck mattered more than the inconvenience of walking home at night. Her roommate often stayed up, waiting, listening for the sound of keys turning in the lock. But most mornings Emily returned safely, tired but ready to sleep until the afternoon. The Harris family was proud of her determination. Robert often said that Emily had inherited his work ethic. No excuses, just persistence. Linda admitted she worried about her daughter working at those hours, but also believed Emily knew what she was doing. Daniel, the younger brother, looked up to her. She wasn't just his sister. She was proof that someone from their background could push toward something more. Her days followed a rhythm that never seemed to change. Wake up late in the afternoon. Eat a quick dinner at home or at the store before her shift. Work until 3 in the morning. Walk home. Sleep. Repeat. Her life was built on repetition. A cycle that gave the illusion of safety because nothing unexpected had ever happened. Neighbors recognized her. Regular customers noticed her. She wasn't invisible in her community, but she wasn't the type who sought attention either. She blended into the rhythm of night work, part of the background of a city that never really sleeps. In her free time, she was known to keep a notebook. She wrote down ideas, schedules, even goals. The entries weren't emotional confessions. They were practical notes about what she wanted to accomplish. It showed a kind of discipline that fit with how people described her: organized, focused, and responsible. She wasn't a risk taker. She wasn't careless. She wasn't involved in dangerous circles. On paper, she was exactly the kind of young woman who should have been safe, even if the hours were long and the walk home was dark. But the night she vanished was different. On that Friday, Emily followed the same pattern she always did. She left her apartment for her shift at Circle K. She worked her usual hours. She stocked shelves, counted the register, and closed up at 3 in the morning. Security cameras recorded her walking out of the store with a small backpack slung over her shoulder. She didn't appear rushed or frightened. She looked like someone heading home the same way she had done so many times before. What no one knew then was that this would be the last time she was seen alive. Her roommate expected to hear the door open around 3:20 a.m., the usual time it took Emily to make the short walk back. But that morning, the apartment stayed quiet. By sunrise, the bed in Emily's room was still neatly made, untouched. The roommate assumed she had stayed with a friend or gone to her parents' house. There was no immediate panic. Young adults often made last-minute decisions without calling home. It wasn't until the next day that concern grew. Emily's family hadn't heard from her. Her phone went unanswered. Her job confirmed she had worked her shift and left on time. The roommate's worry turned into dread. On the second day, Robert and Linda Harris went to the police and reported their daughter missing. Detectives began retracing her steps. They checked the Circle K cameras, spoke with employees, and canvassed the neighborhood. The path Emily walked every night was examined closely. On the third day, a search turned up a chilling piece of evidence: one of Emily's shoes, lying in the dirt near the side of the road. The ground showed marks that suggested a struggle. That was all they had. No body, no phone, no backpack, just a shoe, scratches on the earth, and silence. The discovery stunned her family. For years they had trusted that her routine, though difficult, was safe enough. Now it was clear something violent had interrupted the life of a young woman simply walking home. This shift from normal to terrifying was the turning point. Emily Harris was no longer just a daughter, sister, or employee. She was now a missing person in what would become one of Phoenix's most haunting cases. Her story became a reminder of how quickly an ordinary routine can collapse. The safe 15-minute walk home, repeated night after night, turned out to be the window of opportunity for someone waiting in the shadows. And that was the last known moment of Emily Harris's life as it had been. A reliable worker, a dutiful daughter, a young woman saving money for her future. All of it ended on a walk she had made countless times before. She had been through that same path so often that nobody thought twice about it. Not her family, not her roommate, not even Emily herself. But on that early morning in 2007, something different happened. Something that would take her off the streets, leave her family desperate for answers, and begin an investigation that would stretch for more than a decade. The questions started immediately. Who had seen her leave? Did anyone follow her? Did anyone hear the struggle that left her shoe on the ground? Leads would eventually emerge. Suspects would come under scrutiny. But in those first few days, all that mattered was one truth. Emily Harris left work at 3 a.m. and never came home. It was Friday, June 2007. The air was heavy and warm, the kind of summer night in Phoenix when the streets fall silent after midnight. By 3 a.m, the city felt empty. Businesses were closed, traffic slowed to almost nothing. It was the time of night when only the night shift workers and long-haul truckers were awake. At exactly 3 a.m., Emily Harris ended her shift at the Circle K convenience store near Interstate 17. The store's cameras caught the routine moment. She finished counting the register, grabbed her small backpack, and walked out the front doors. She looked calm, moving with the same steady pace she had walked dozens of times before. No sign of hesitation, no sign that anything was wrong. The camera showed her crossing the parking lot. Beyond that, there were no more cameras. The streets outside were quiet, dimly lit, and nearly empty. She was heading home the same way she always did, 15 minutes on foot, from the Circle K to her apartment on West Monroe Street. It was a short route she had taken night after night without trouble. Her path was simple. A straight stretch along the main road, a left turn down a quieter street, then another block before reaching her building. But that night, what should have been an ordinary walk turned into the last confirmed sighting of Emily Harris alive. At 3:20 a.m., a truck driver passing through gave a statement later. He said he saw a young woman matching Emily's description walking alone on the sidewalk. The driver remembered because she looked so young to be out at that hour. She carried a bag and walked quickly, keeping her eyes forward. It was the only independent confirmation that Emily made it part of the way home. There was another detail that night. A local resident later told police that he saw Jason Miller, a young man known to hang around the Circle K, loitering outside the store. Jason had a history with Emily. He had shown interest in her before, interest she had clearly rejected. People remembered him as persistent, sometimes aggressive, unwilling to take no for an answer. Seeing him near the Circle K on the same night Emily vanished raised immediate suspicion. But in that moment, nobody realized the danger. To the few people awake at 3 a.m, the scene looked ordinary. A young woman walking home, a man standing outside a convenience store, and a city asleep. The hours passed. Sunrise came. Emily never arrived home. Her roommate noticed first. When she woke later that morning, Emily's bed was still made. The blanket hadn't been touched. The pillow was in place. It looked exactly as it had when Emily left for work the night before. At first, the roommate wasn't alarmed. Maybe Emily... By the second day, the worry turned into fear. Emily's parents, Robert and Linda, hadn't spoken to her. She hadn't called, hadn't answered her phone, and hadn't shown up for anything she had planned. Her younger brother Daniel hadn't heard from her either. Robert drove to the apartment demanding answers, but there were none. Her roommate explained that Emily never came home after work. That's when the family went to the police and filed a missing person report. Detectives began piecing together the last known movements. They pulled the security footage from Circle K. They confirmed that Emily ended her shift at 3 a.m., walked out with her bag, and disappeared into the night. They interviewed coworkers, customers, and neighbors. They collected what little they could. One witness who saw her on the road, another who saw Jason Miller hanging near the store. It wasn't much, but it was a start. On the third day, the first physical evidence appeared. A search team combed the area between the Circle K and Emily's apartment. That's when they found it, one of Emily's shoes lying in the dirt by the side of the road. It was a white sneaker, dirty and scuffed, but clearly hers. The location was about 10 minutes into her usual walk home, not far from where the truck driver had reported seeing her. Investigators studied the ground around the shoe. The dirt showed signs of disturbance, drag marks, scuffs, impressions that suggested a brief struggle had taken place. There were no clear footprints to follow, no tire tracks they could identify. But the marks told a story. Emily hadn't simply dropped the shoe. Something had happened. Something sudden and violent. The discovery shifted the case immediately. What started as a missing person investigation became something darker. Detectives now believed Emily had been attacked on her way home. The missing phone and missing backpack confirmed it. If she had left voluntarily, she would have taken her belongings. The fact that only a shoe was left behind pointed toward abduction. No one in the area reported hearing screams. No one reported seeing a car pull up. No cameras caught the struggle. For such a public space, it was as if the night had swallowed her whole. The family was devastated. Robert Harris demanded answers from the police. Linda held on to the hope that maybe Emily was alive, maybe taken but not gone forever. Daniel, only 16, could barely process what was happening. Their daughter and sister had walked a path she had taken countless times before, and now she was gone, without explanation. Detectives expanded their search. They questioned residents along the route. Some admitted they hadn't been awake. Others said they didn't notice anything unusual. The hours between 3 and 4 in the morning left little opportunity. Attention quickly turned toward potential suspects. The violent ex-convict who lived in South Phoenix, Mark Reynolds, had been seen near the area in the past. His record of assaults made him a person of interest. At the same time, Jason Miller, the young man who had harassed Emily before, had been seen near the Circle K that same night. Both men became the immediate focus of investigators. But that was still to come. For now, the evidence was limited. One shoe, a disturbed patch of dirt, 2 separate witness statements that placed Emily and Jason Miller in the same area that night. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to confirm the worst fear. Emily had not disappeared by choice. The case entered a critical phase. The first 72 hours in a disappearance are always the most important. Leads were thin, but detectives pushed forward. They reviewed the Circle K footage again, frame by frame, hoping for a clue. They interviewed the truck driver repeatedly, pressing him for more details about what he saw at 3:20 a.m. They canvassed gas stations, motels, and late-night diners, hoping someone might have noticed something strange. Nothing solid emerged. No body, no vehicle, no clear suspect. The media began reporting on the case. Local news stations ran Emily's photo, describing her as 21 years old, last seen leaving her job at Circle K. Reporters highlighted the discovery of her shoe, the disturbed dirt, and the possibility of foul play. Community members joined search efforts, combing the desert outskirts, calling her name, and hoping for a sign. But nothing surfaced. 3 days after she vanished, the story of Emily Harris was no longer just another missing person case. It had become a potential abduction, the kind of case that draws public attention because of how ordinary the circumstances seemed. A young woman walking home after work, a path she had traveled safely so many times. And then, without warning, she was gone. From that point forward, the case could no longer be viewed as routine. Detectives shifted their mindset. This was no longer just about waiting for someone to come home. It was about finding who had taken her, and why. And that's where the focus turned next. From one shoe and a set of faint scuff marks, investigators began to ask hard questions. Who in Emily's life had motive? Who had opportunity? Who had the history to suggest violence? The investigation was just beginning, but already the pressure was building. For the family, the nightmare had only just started. For the police, the evidence was thin, but the urgency was clear. The first suspect was about to emerge. The discovery of Emily Harris's shoe changed everything. Up to that point, police treated her disappearance as a missing person case. But once investigators saw the scuffed dirt and signs of a struggle, they reclassified it. This was no longer a young woman failing to come home. It was a possible abduction, and every hour mattered. Detectives widened their search. They drew a perimeter around the Circle K and the 15-minute walking route Emily always took. Officers canvassed houses, questioned night shift workers, and checked for any cameras that might have caught the road outside the store. Most businesses had closed hours earlier. Most houses were dark. It was 3 in the morning, and the city had been asleep. Even so, bits of information began to come in. A truck driver recalled seeing Emily around 3:20 a.m., walking fast, keeping her head down. Another resident remembered spotting someone else that night, a man hanging around the Circle K parking lot. He wasn't an unfamiliar face. His name was Mark Reynolds. Reynolds was 29 years old in 2007. He lived on the edges of Phoenix, staying in motels when he could afford them, and on couches when he couldn't. He had no steady work, no fixed address, and a reputation for trouble. Police already knew his name. 4 years earlier, in 2003, he had been arrested for assaulting a girlfriend. He served 18 months in prison. Since then, his life had spiraled further downward, fueled by alcohol and erratic behavior. Clerks at local convenience stores said they often saw him drunk, shouting, sometimes scaring customers. The Circle K where Emily worked was one of his usual stops. Employees had reported him loitering in the parking lot, pacing, muttering to himself. More than once, managers asked him to leave. He always came back. For detectives trying to understand who might have attacked Emily Harris, Mark Reynolds quickly rose to the top of the list. He was in the area. He had a violent history. He fit the profile of someone capable of snapping in a moment of rage. Investigators brought him in for questioning. The interview was tense from the start. Reynolds admitted he had been drinking heavily the night Emily disappeared. He said he wandered near the Circle K sometime after midnight but denied seeing Emily or crossing her path. When pressed about his exact movements between 3 and 4 a.m., the critical window, his answers wavered. He said he didn't remember clearly. At one point, he claimed he walked south toward his motel. At another, he said he sat near a gas station until sunrise. Detectives asked who could confirm his story. He couldn't name anyone. No bartender, no friend, no witness. His alibi collapsed under its own vagueness. His body language didn't help him either. Interrogators noted his defensiveness, the way his tone shifted when Emily's name came up, the bursts of anger followed by silence. To experienced detectives, these were red flags. But red flags weren't evidence. Police searched the motel where Reynolds had been staying. They collected his clothing, his shoes, and his belongings. Forensics teams combed through his room looking for traces of blood, fibers, or any sign that Emily had been there. They examined his car, pulling up carpet fibers, checking the trunk, spraying for hidden stains. The results came back empty. No DNA belonging to Emily. No hair, no fibers, no fingerprints. Nothing connecting him to the missing woman. Detectives returned to the scene. They measured the distance from the Circle K to where Emily's shoe was found. They walked the route themselves, noting the lighting, the blind corners, the stretches where no houses looked out onto the road. They asked themselves whether Reynolds could have attacked her there, in that short window, without being seen. On paper, it was possible. He had the violence in his past, the proximity, and the lack of an alibi. He had been seen near the store that very night. But the case lacked the one thing it needed: proof. Without physical evidence, the investigation ran into walls. Witnesses remembered seeing him loitering, but not attacking. Security cameras showed Emily leaving work, but not Reynolds following her. His record made him look dangerous, but a record alone couldn't convict him. Still, police leaned heavily on him. For weeks, Reynolds was the prime suspect. Detectives interviewed him multiple times, hoping inconsistency would break him. They followed him, watched his movements, and tracked who he spoke to. They checked his bank records and cell phone activity. They found nothing unusual. As the investigation dragged on, the community began drawing its own conclusions. Neighbors who heard about his past crimes believed he was guilty. Parents warned their daughters to avoid the Circle K at night. In the eyes of the public, Reynolds became the face of the crime. His name was whispered in bars and printed in speculative articles. The logic was simple. He had hurt women before, so he must have done it again. The Harris family struggled with the uncertainty. Robert, Emily's father, pushed the police to act. He demanded arrests, demanded stronger action, demanded justice. Linda, her mother, held on to hope, but admitted privately that Reynolds seemed like the kind of man who could have done it. Daniel, the younger brother, said he couldn't walk past the Circle K without picturing Reynolds lurking in the shadows. But in law enforcement, suspicion wasn't enough. Prosecutors told detectives they had no case to file. Without DNA, without a witness, without a body, Reynolds would walk free. The frustration grew inside the task force. Officers replayed the scenario again and again. If Reynolds had taken Emily, where was she? Why hadn't he slipped up? Why hadn't any evidence turned up in his motel, in his car, in his life? Weeks turned into months. Leads dried up. Reynolds remained under a cloud, but outside of custody. Detectives knew the public wanted resolution, but they also knew they couldn't fabricate a case. Every time they brought him back into the station, he gave the same deflections. He didn't remember. He had nothing to do with it. They were wasting their time. What made the situation harder was the sheer lack of alternatives. Other names came up briefly, transients in the area, other men with criminal pasts, but none matched the combination of presence, history, and timing that Reynolds did. For investigators, he was still their strongest lead, even if the evidence didn't support it. Months after Emily's disappearance, the case file grew thick with notes about Reynolds. Witness statements, timelines, transcripts of interviews. But each page ended with the same conclusion: insufficient evidence. The family's frustration turned to despair. They attended press conferences where police insisted the case was ongoing. They pleaded with the public for tips. They distributed flyers, spoke to reporters, and offered rewards. All the while, Reynolds' name loomed over the story. The community's anger deepened. People pointed at him in the streets. Motels stopped renting to him. Employers refused him work. Guilty or not, his reputation was destroyed, but the police still couldn't charge him. The case teetered on the edge of collapse. Without a body, without physical links, investigators could not push forward. By the end of the first year, even detectives began to wonder if they had focused too much on Reynolds. He looked guilty, but appearances alone wouldn't bring Emily back or put someone behind bars. That's when another name began to rise. Another man with a very different relationship to Emily. Not a drifter, not a violent stranger. Someone she actually knew. Someone who had tried to be closer to her, and who hadn't taken rejection well. While Reynolds remained under suspicion, a second line of investigation was forming. And this new suspect wasn't a stranger lurking outside the store. He was a customer, a familiar face, and to some, a far more chilling possibility. While detectives kept their eyes on Mark Reynolds, another name began to surface. Unlike Reynolds, this man wasn't a drifter with a violent record. He wasn't a stranger in the shadows. He was someone Emily actually knew. Someone who had been around the Circle K often enough that employees recognized his face. His name was Jason Miller. Jason was 23 years old at the time of Emily's disappearance. He lived with his mother, Deborah, a nurse, in a modest house about 10 minutes from the Circle K. Unlike Reynolds, Jason had no prior convictions for violent crime. But what he did have was a history with Emily, and that history drew police attention quickly. Jason had been a frequent customer at the Circle K. He came in late at night, bought drinks or snacks, and lingered longer than most. Employees noticed that he always wanted to talk to Emily. At first, she was polite, but it soon became clear that Jason's interest went beyond casual conversation. He asked her out more than once. She refused. Friends later told investigators that Emily tried to let him down gently. She said she wasn't interested, but Jason didn't seem to hear it. After the rejection, his behavior grew more intense. He began sending her messages. Some sounded harmless on the surface, but others carried undertones of jealousy and control. He asked where she was, who she was with, why she hadn't replied. The tone shifted from friendly to demanding. One message stood out to detectives later. "If you're not with me, you're not with anyone." Emily mentioned Jason's persistence to a few friends. She didn't frame him as dangerous, but she admitted he made her uncomfortable. Friends described Jason as someone who didn't know how to let go. They worried his fixation might escalate. That fear took on new weight when investigators learned about the night Emily vanished. A witness came forward saying they saw Jason loitering near the Circle K around the same time Emily finished her shift. It wasn't the first time he had been there late at night. But in hindsight, the timing was too sharp to ignore. Police brought Jason in for questioning. At first, he denied everything. He said he hadn't seen Emily that night, hadn't followed her, hadn't been near the Circle K at all. But when detectives pressed him with the witness statement, his story changed. He admitted he had been in the area but insisted it was only a coincidence. He said he drove past the store after visiting a friend, then headed home. Detectives asked for the friend's name. Jason hesitated, then gave one. But when investigators tracked the friend down, the alibi didn't hold. The friend said he hadn't seen Jason that night. Investigators examined his phone. They didn't find messages sent the night of Emily's disappearance, but they did find the history of texts from weeks before, dozens of messages that painted a picture of obsession, pleas for attention, demands for replies, hintily veiled threats. It was clear Emily had been under pressure from him. Still, the phone didn't provide a smoking gun. There was no record of a call that night. No location data placing him directly on Emily's route home. Nothing forensic tying him to the scene. Detectives searched his house and car. They looked for fibers, blood, signs of a struggle. The results came back clean. His car showed no trace of Emily. His clothes carried no evidence. With every step, the case grew more frustrating. On the surface, Jason had the motive. He had the opportunity. He had been in the area. But without physical evidence, the case remained built on suspicion, not proof. The Harris family learned of the investigation into Jason. For them, the theory fit. Emily had mentioned him before. She had described his persistence. Robert Harris, her father, told reporters he believed Jason was involved. Linda, her mother, said she feared the same, but wanted police to prove it once and for all. But proof never came. As the investigation into Jason deepened, detectives kept hitting the same wall. No DNA, no body, no clear eyewitness. They could suggest, but they couldn't confirm. The district attorney's office told them flatly there wasn't enough for a charge. Meanwhile, the community grew restless. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed Jason was guilty. They pointed to his obsession, his threatening messages, his presence near the Circle K. Others dismissed him as a scapegoat, a young man who acted awkwardly but hadn't committed a crime. The divide echoed through Phoenix. In coffee shops, in grocery store lines, people debated which suspect was the real one: Reynolds, the violent ex-con, or Jason, the rejected admirer. Detectives felt the same division inside the department. Some believed Jason's motive was stronger than Reynolds's. Others argued Reynolds's violent history made him more likely. Both suspects had reasons. Both had opportunities. Both looked guilty in their own ways. But neither could be tied directly to Emily's disappearance. The longer the case dragged, the colder it became. Leads dried up. Search efforts slowed. The media moved on to other stories. But the Harris family was left in limbo, caught between two suspects and no resolution. For Robert, the anger deepened. He criticized the police publicly, saying they had failed his daughter. He accused them of not doing enough, of letting suspects slip away. For Linda, the silence was unbearable. She kept Emily's room exactly as it was, refusing to change anything. For Daniel, the younger brother, suspicion poisoned everything. He saw Jason on the news and thought of the man who wouldn't stop calling his sister. Yet Jason walked free. The law required evidence, and the case file thickened with notes, interviews, and reports. But at the bottom line, the words were always the same. Insufficient evidence. By the end of the first year, the investigation had stalled completely. Reynolds remained a suspect. Jason remained a suspect. But neither could be charged. Neither could be cleared. The Harris family kept waiting for an arrest that never came. The police kept searching for evidence that didn't exist. And the city kept whispering about what happened to Emily Harris on that dark summer night. This was the moment when the case crossed a line. From an active search into a cold case. From a story of investigation into a story of waiting. And as the years passed, suspicion alone was all anyone had. 12 years passed between a missing person report and a confession. In those years, the case file on Emily Harris went from active to cold. Detectives moved on. Supervisors were reassigned. The family stayed. The shift happened slowly at first. After the first surge of searches and interviews, leads stalled. No new witnesses came forward. No new footage surfaced. The shoe in the scuffed dirt near the roadside remained the only physical signs of a struggle. Without a body, without DNA, without a reliable eyewitness, the investigation bled momentum. The case was reclassified. It became a cold case. Police said it plainly in briefings. No new developments. No probable cause for an arrest. The department encouraged tips, but internally most lines had been checked and closed. Evidence stayed boxed in climate-controlled storage. Reports were digitized. The case waited for something to shake it loose. The Harris family refused to let it fade. Robert Harris stood at microphones and demanded progress. He criticized the pace, the priorities, and the results. He asked for stronger canvases, wider perimeters, new technology. He wanted answers a file could not give. He pressed elected officials. He sent letters. He called the sergeant in charge, and then the lieutenant above him. He did not stop. At home, the absence was visible. Linda Harris kept Emily's room intact. Clothes folded, books stacked. A small notebook on the desk exactly where Emily had left it. For Linda, it was not a shrine. It was evidence that a life had existed and should have continued. She spoke rarely to reporters, but when she did, she said the same thing. "Bring my daughter home." Daniel, 16 when his sister vanished, put his own plans aside. He deferred college. He developed a skill the case required. Persistence. He learned how to file records requests. He learned who to call at the department and how to speak to volunteers. He joined community groups that supported families of the missing. Over time, he became a contact point for other parents and siblings who were also waiting. Every June, on the date Emily disappeared, the family held a vigil. They chose a small park not far from the Circle K. Candles, a printed photo, a table for flyers. The first year, local news came. The second year, fewer cameras. By year 5, it was mostly neighbors, church members, and classmates. They read a brief statement. They asked for tips. They reminded people that a victim was more than a headline. The community divided around the two early suspects. Some were convinced Mark Reynolds did it. They cited his record, his rage, his presence near the store. Others pointed at Jason Miller. They remembered his messages and his late-night loitering. The split hardened with time. Each anniversary revived the debate. Online threads rehashed the same facts, the same rumors, the same conclusions. It did not move the case forward, but it kept the case present. Inside the department, cold case supervisors reviewed Emily's file on a schedule, usually tied to staffing or a grant cycle. The checklist was standard. Re-interview key witnesses if contact information was current. Confirm that all biological samples, if any, were still viable. Run names through updated databases. Check for similar abductions with shared patterns. Confirm there were no hits in SODIS or AFIS. Document the review and return the file to storage. Technology improved, but not every case benefited. There was no DNA to retest. There were no latent prints from a vehicle or a room. The store cameras had captured a departure, not an attack. Street cameras in that neighborhood did not exist in 2007. The shoe had been handled and bagged properly, but it did not yield a usable profile. The scuffed dirt was a scene, not a sample. From time to time, tips arrived. A driver thought he remembered a car idling near the intersection that night. A former motel clerk believed a guest had checked in with muddy shoes. A woman claimed she had seen a young man carrying a backpack along a frontage road at sunrise. Detectives followed up when they could. Most tips led to more paperwork and closed loops. None brought Emily back. The family tried new angles. Billboards along the interstate. Mailers to residents living within a mile of the route home. A reward fund, managed by a local non-profit, that carried over from year to year. A social media page run by Daniel that posted case facts and contact numbers only. No rumors, no speculation. He kept the tone firm and restrained. Dates, times, locations, who to call. Pressure on the police rose and fell with the news cycle. A similar case in another state would spark comparisons. A new chief would announce a fresh look at legacy files. A reporter would revisit the story for a Sunday feature. Each burst raised hopes, then settled back into routine. The cold case unit was small. The volume of files was large. Emily's case competed for hours with dozens of others. What changed slowly, then clearly, was the emotional cost. Robert's public statements shifted from urgent to hard. He said less to cameras and more to investigators behind closed doors. Linda grew quieter. She attended every vigil, but the wider city moved on. New crimes demanded attention. New developments drew residents into other concerns. Outside Emily's neighborhood, the case was a memory. Inside it, the case was a gap that never closed. The Circle K changed managers. Staff turned over. The route home remained the same length in steps and minutes, but people looked away from it when they drove by. Years 6 through 10 followed the same pattern. Annual vigil, periodic media, file reviews, dead ends. In year 9, a retired detective offered to consult for free. He mapped other abductions of night shift workers across state lines. He proposed a profile built on opportunity and travel corridors. It was methodical work, but without new evidence, it did not convert to action. The family's hope adjusted. In private, they admitted 2 parallel goals: find Emily, or, if that was no longer possible, find the truth of what happened. They wanted a location, a name, and an account that matched the known facts. They wanted something they could stand on. The room remained untouched. By year 11, the cold case unit ran another administrative review. The supervisor noted the same constraints and logged the same outcome. No testable evidence, no probable cause, no charges. The file went back to the shelf. 12 years is a long time to wait without answers. It changes how people speak. It strips sentences down. When reporters asked what the family wanted, Robert said, "Movement." Linda said, "Her." Daniel said, "Proof." The case needed an outside spark. It would not come from the roadside where the shoe was found. It would not come from the apartment bedroom kept ready. It would not come from the two suspects who had defined the early narrative. It would come from somewhere else, far from Phoenix, far from the route home, far from the Circle K. In 2019, that spark arrived, not as a lab result, not as a new witness. It came in the form of handcuffs placed on a different man in a different state. A man with a pattern, a man who targeted women who worked late and walked alone. During interrogation, he began to talk. He talked about routes and timing. He talked about isolation and speed. He talked about a night in 2007 in Phoenix, Arizona. Before that moment, the file had been a record of silence. After that moment, it would become a record of an admission. The Harris family, the detectives who still remembered the first searches, and a community that had argued itself into circles, would finally hear words they had waited 12 years to hear. 12 years of no evidence. 12 years of vigils and calls and stored boxes. The quiet broke in a single interview room, hundreds of miles from where Emily disappeared. And the truth started to move toward the family that had never stopped asking for it. For 12 years, the name Emily Harris stayed frozen inside a cold case file. Police had followed every lead they could, questioned two main suspects, chased rumors, and searched again and again. But no body was found, no DNA matched, no witness could put the pieces together. The case was silent, unresolved, and almost forgotten outside her family and her small community. Then, in 2019, a phone call came in that changed everything. The FBI had just made an arrest in New Mexico. The man's name was Tom Caldwell. He was 35 years old, transient, moving from state to state, staying in motels, taking odd jobs, never rooted in one place. He had been caught in connection with the murder of another young woman. The pattern was chilling. A victim working a late shift, walking home or heading to her car, ambushed, abducted, and killed. Caldwell's arrest immediately drew attention from federal and state investigators. They suspected they had not just caught a single killer, but possibly a serial predator who had been operating quietly across state lines for more than a decade. His movements placed him in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico during years when several unsolved murders of young women remained open. Detectives wanted answers. During interrogation, Caldwell at first denied everything. He shifted his stories, played games, and tried to minimize his role. But after hours of questioning, when investigators pressed him with evidence from the New Mexico crime, he broke. He began to talk. What he said stunned everyone in the room. Caldwell admitted he had killed not one, not two, but several women across the Southwest. He described watching them, following them, waiting for the right moment when they were alone. He explained how he used his car to cut them off, how he forced them inside, and how he made sure no one could find the bodies. And then, in the middle of these confessions, he spoke the name that Arizona detectives had been waiting 12 years to hear. Emily Harris. Caldwell called her one of the firsts. He said it casually, like he was listing names from memory. But when pressed, he provided details only the real killer could know. He remembered the store. He remembered the time. He remembered how she carried a small backpack and how she always walked instead of driving. He described waiting outside the Circle K in Phoenix during the early hours of a summer morning in 2007. He said he saw Emily leave the store at the end of her shift, just after 3 a.m. He watched her start down the road she always took home.
He followed in his car, creeping along until the street grew darker and the houses thinned.
According to Caldwell, he stopped his vehicle ahead of her, stepped out, and blocked her path. Emily resisted. He admitted there was a struggle on the roadside. That detail matched the scuff marks officers had documented near where her shoe was later found. He said he forced her into his car and drove off into the night. Investigators listened as Caldwell explained what he did next. He said he drove south, away from Phoenix, toward Tucson. By dawn, he had reached a stretch of desert land north of the city, remote, empty, full of dry washes and scattered mesquite. He said he left her body there. He was certain no one would ever find it. Detectives compared his statement against the old case files. Every point lined up. The missing shoe found near the roadside. The scuff marks suggesting a struggle. The lack of evidence near the Circle K itself. The absence of any witness who saw her after 3:20 a.m. Caldwell's account filled the silence with horrifying precision. Even the method matched. Other victims attributed to Caldwell had been young women working night shifts. They were clerks, cashiers, or waitresses. They were attacked when their shifts ended, when they were tired, when the streets were empty, and when no one was there to see. His pattern was consistent. Emily's case was part of it. For investigators in Arizona, the confession was both a breakthrough and a bitter pill. For 12 years, they had focused on Mark Reynolds and Jason Miller. One was a violent drifter, the other an obsessed admirer. Both had looked guilty, both had drawn suspicion, both had been named by the community as likely killers, and yet neither of them had anything to do with Emily's death. Caldwell's arrest and confession were covered nationally as well. He was linked to at least half a dozen cases across the Southwest. Each victim shared similar traits with Emily. Each family had lived through the same cycle of hope and despair. For them, too, his words were both closure and cruelty. In Phoenix, vigils for Emily shifted in tone. They were no longer simply pleas for answers. They became acknowledgments of a truth confirmed, however painful. At one vigil, Daniel Harris told the crowd that the family had waited 12 years for answers and had finally received them. He said they still had no grave to visit, but at least they knew who had taken Emily away. For detectives who had worked the case in 2007, the confession was both vindication and frustration. Vindication that the struggle they documented was real, that the crime had been correctly classified as an abduction. Frustration that they had spent so long on suspects who were never involved. Some admitted privately that the lack of physical evidence had trapped them. Without DNA, without a body, they had no choice but to circle the most obvious suspects. Caldwell had slipped through because he had been a stranger, and strangers rarely fit the first narrative. In the end, the confession stood as the final word on Emily Harris's disappearance. Caldwell would face charges for multiple murders, but the specific charge for Emily's case was complicated. Without a recovered body, without direct forensic evidence, prosecutors had to rely on his words. Still, they documented everything, ensuring the record reflected what he admitted. The Harris family accepted that they might never recover Emily's remains. The desert where Caldwell claimed to have left her was vast and harsh. Searches were attempted, but nothing was found. Time and weather had erased too much. For Linda Harris, this meant keeping Emily's room exactly as it had always been. For Robert, it meant focusing on advocating for stronger protections for night shift workers. For Daniel, it meant helping other families in cold cases understand what persistence could eventually bring. The confession closed the case, but it also left lingering questions. How many other women had Caldwell killed? How many other families were still waiting for answers he had not yet provided? For Phoenix, the resolution was bittersweet. The community had wanted the truth, but the truth was worse than imagined. It was not a neighbor. It was not someone known. It was a predator from nowhere, capable of striking and vanishing again. Part 7 ends with the confession itself as the climax. Emily Harris's disappearance was solved not by evidence pulled from the dirt, not by breakthroughs in DNA, but by the words of a killer caught years later. The family had waited more than a decade for those words. The city had debated for just as long. Now, at last, they had an answer. But as everyone quickly realized, an answer is not the same as justice. The confession of Thomas Caldwell gave the Harris family what they had demanded for more than a decade: an answer. But an answer is not the same as peace. For Robert Harris, the father, the news came with both rage and exhaustion. He had stood before cameras for years demanding the police do more, demanding that suspects be arrested. He had blamed Mark Reynolds, then Jason Miller. Now he had to accept that the truth was entirely different. The real killer had been a stranger passing through, a man with no connection to his daughter, a man who had already killed others and would have kept going if not stopped. Robert said the hardest part was knowing that while his family was living in torment, Caldwell was out there, free, hunting again. For Linda Harris, the mother, the confession was a final confirmation of what she had already feared. Her daughter was gone, and the room she had kept preserved for 12 years would never welcome Emily home again. Linda's words to the press were brief. She said she was grateful to finally know the truth, but she wished she had a grave to visit. She said the room in their small home was the only place she could still feel her daughter's presence. Daniel Harris, who was just 16 when Emily disappeared, had grown into an adult with the case as the shadow of his life. The confession validated his years of advocacy. He had worked with families of other missing children, organized vigils, and kept his sister's name alive. But even he admitted that closure was incomplete. Caldwell's confession did not bring his sister back, and it did not erase the pain of 12 years spent not knowing. For the wider community, the impact was just as sharp. For years, people had argued over which suspect was guilty. Neighbors had sworn it was Reynolds. Others had whispered about Jason Miller. Social media threads debated the evidence, repeating the same facts again and again. And yet, in the end, both men were innocent. Neither had harmed Emily. They had carried the suspicion for more than a decade, and in some ways their lives had been destroyed by it. Mark Reynolds had never escaped his reputation as the violent drifter who was probably guilty. Even when he moved, people knew his name. Jason Miller had lived with whispers that he was obsessed enough to kill. Caldwell's confession cleared them, but it came far too late to restore their lives to what they had been. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about the investigation itself. Why had detectives missed Caldwell? Why had no one connected the pattern of late-night abductions across state lines sooner? Some officers admitted privately that without a body or DNA, they had no way to chase a stranger. Investigations tend to focus on people known to the victim. The FBI and state authorities announced that Caldwell would face charges for multiple murders. Some of those cases had stronger evidence than Emily's. Bodies had been recovered. Forensic samples had survived. In Emily's case, prosecutors relied entirely on Caldwell's confession and the consistency of his method. It was enough to confirm the truth, but not enough to build a full prosecution. For the Harris family, that was another blow. They wanted a trial that named their daughter in the indictment. They wanted Caldwell to stand in court and answer directly for her death. Instead, they had to watch him prosecuted for other murders. Caldwell would spend the rest of his life in prison, but Emily's name would not appear in the official charges. For Robert Harris, that was unacceptable. For Linda, it was unbearable. For Daniel, it was one more reminder that closure often comes incomplete. Still, the confession had meaning. It shifted Emily's case out of the cold file cabinet and into the record of confirmed victims. It corrected years of suspicion cast on two innocent men. It gave the family an explanation, even if it was one they had dreaded. It turned rumor into fact. In Phoenix, the annual vigil continued, but with a different tone. Now it was not a vigil for the missing, but a remembrance of the murdered. People lit candles not to call for answers, but to honor Emily's memory and to acknowledge the truth that had finally come. The case also forced a broader reflection. How many other women had been taken by strangers no one suspected? How many other families were still holding vigils, waiting for answers that might never come? Emily's story became a reminder that not all crimes are solved by persistence alone. Sometimes it takes the confession of a killer, years later, to break the silence. The community also began to look at safety differently. Conversations arose about whether young women should be walking home alone after night shifts. Employers were pressured to provide escorts or security. Local officials pushed for better lighting along pedestrian routes. Advocates pointed out that responsibility should not fall only on victims to protect themselves. The system needed to anticipate threats, not just respond after the fact. For the Harris family, reflection came slowly. They had spent 12 years living in a state of waiting. Now they had to learn how to live in a state of knowing. The difference was enormous. Knowing who had killed Emily did not remove their grief. It did not restore the years lost, but it gave them a place to rest their questions, even if their hearts remained restless. As Robert put it, we asked for answers. We got them. But answers don't heal. They only tell you what you already feared. Linda's words were quieter. I don't have a grave. I have a room. That will never change. And Daniel, standing before the vigil crowd, said what his family had come to accept. We don't have closure. We have truth. And sometimes that has to be enough. Emily Harris's disappearance and death joined the long list of cold cases that ended not with a trial, not with a body, but with the words of a killer who finally admitted what he had done. Her story reminded people that justice is not always clean, not always complete, and not always satisfying. The case left a permanent scar on her family, her community, and the investigators who had carried it for years. It also left a lingering question for everyone who heard it. If a young woman could vanish so quickly, so close to home, at the end of a normal shift, what other tragedies still remain hidden in cold files, waiting for someone to confess? That question closes the story of Emily Harris, a reminder that behind every cold case is a family waiting, a community divided, and sometimes a truth that comes too late. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Every week we uncover another case that raises the same questions. What happened? How it happened? and why justice took so long. Your support helps keep these stories alive.